The morning was quiet along the Green River in Washington state. Mist rolled over the water, and the only sounds came from the rushing current and the occasional cry of a bird. But in the summer of 1982, that silence was broken by a discovery that would terrify the community for years to come. A young boy, walking along the banks near the airport, stumbled on something floating in the water. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, but as he got closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was the body of a woman. Police rushed to the scene. They pulled her out of the shallow water, noting the way she'd been strangled and discarded like trash. Just days later, more bodies were found nearby, one after another. The river began giving up its secrets. Most of the victims were young women, some just teenagers. Many had been working as sex workers or living on the streets, women who were often ignored or forgotten by society. To the killer, they were easy prey. To the police, they were the beginning of a nightmare. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with just one isolated murder. This was something far bigger, something darker. The killer seemed to know the backroads, forests, and waterways of King County like the back of his hand. He struck without warning, choosing women who could vanish without immediate notice. By the time families reported them missing, it was already too late. Fear spread quickly. Women in the Seattle and Tacoma area were warned not to walk alone, not to trust strangers offering rides, not to get into cars they didn't know. But the killer kept hunting. The Green River became a graveyard, its name forever tied to horror. At first, the police thought the murders would stop once they were discovered, but they didn't. The bodies kept appearing. Detectives gave the unknown predator a name, the Green River Killer. It was a label that captured the terror of the moment, though nobody knew who he really was. Some victims were found weeks after their disappearance, others months. Their remains scattered through wooded trails and lonely ravines. Investigators collected every clue they could: fibers, fingerprints, tire tracks, but nothing pointed directly to the murderer. The public wanted answers, but the police had few to give. They interviewed men connected to the victims. They followed tips from frightened residents. They even considered truck drivers who traveled through the region, since many bodies were found near highways. But every lead seemed to fade into dead ends. Meanwhile, the killer continued, calm and relentless. What shocked investigators most was how the crimes were carried out. The killer strangled his victims with his bare hands or with simple ligatures, sometimes using their own clothing. There were no flashy weapons, no elaborate setups. His method was personal, brutal, and efficient, and the way he disposed of the bodies, hidden in forests, dropped in rivers, showed both knowledge of the land and confidence in his ability to outsmart the law. Detectives believed they were hunting a predator who blended easily into everyday life, someone who could walk past them on the street and never raise suspicion. This thought sent shivers through the community. The Green River Killer wasn't a monster hiding in shadows. He was someone's neighbor, someone who looked ordinary, but who carried death in his hands. The years passed and the body count grew. In time, more than 40 women were linked to the Green River murders, though whispers suggested the true number was much higher. Each new discovery felt like another blow to the city's trust in law enforcement, another sign that the killer was always one step ahead. Parents warned their daughters. Women clutched their keys tighter when they walked alone. And still, he kept killing. By the mid-1980s, the Green River Killer was the most wanted man in America. Task forces were formed. Profiles were drawn. Detectives worked long nights, chasing any lead that might bring them closer. They studied patterns, trying to guess his next move. They even consulted with other famous killers, including Ted Bundy, who was on death row in Florida at the time. Bundy offered chilling insights, suggesting the killer might revisit his dump sites to relive his crimes. Investigators checked, and they found signs that Bundy might have been right. But still, the killer remained free. He moved in silence, killing when he chose, and leaving investigators with nothing but questions. Who was this man who could strangle dozens of women and vanish without a trace? How could he hide for so long while the city lived in fear? The Green River Killer was not just a criminal. He was a shadow that haunted Washington state, a reminder that evil could walk among ordinary people. And while the police searched in the daylight, The killer prowled in the dark. His name, his face, his life. Everything about him remained hidden. But one thing was certain. The Green River Killer was far from finished. The Green River Task Force worked around the clock. By 1984, dozens of detectives, FBI agents, and forensic experts had been pulled into the hunt for the killer. The weight of the case was crushing. Newspapers ran headlines almost daily, asking why the police still hadn't caught the murderer. Politicians demanded answers. Families of the missing women begged for justice. But despite all the pressure, the trail stayed cold. The Green River Killer seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Detectives interviewed hundreds of men. Taxi drivers, pimps, and long-haul truckers were all questioned. One man who stood out was a quiet truck painter named Gary Leon Ridgway. He had been spotted by witnesses talking to sex workers in the area, and police even questioned him in 1983. Ridgway passed a polygraph test, and when his house and truck were searched, nothing suspicious was found. With no hard evidence, detectives let him go. At the time, it seemed like the right call. Years later, it would be clear how close they had been to stopping him. Gary Ridgway looked like the last person anyone would suspect. Born in Salt Lake City in 1949, he moved to Washington and worked at a truck plant. He married 3 times, went to church, and kept steady employment. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, even friendly. He mowed his lawn, waved to neighbors, and lived what seemed like an ordinary suburban life. But beneath that mask, Ridgway was carrying out one of the most horrifying killing sprees in American history. Ridgway targeted women who were already vulnerable. Many were teenagers who had run away from home, women struggling with poverty, or those caught in cycles of addiction. He would pick them up in his truck, often pretending to be a client. He gained their trust by appearing harmless. But once he had them alone, he attacked. His method was always the same: strangulation. To him, it was quick, personal, and efficient. Afterward, he dumped the bodies in wooded areas, rivers, or along highways, sometimes leaving multiple victims in the same spot. Detectives began to realize they weren't dealing with a random predator, but with someone who knew how to hide in plain sight. Ridgway's choice of victims, women who live on the margins of society, made his crimes harder to track. Families often delayed reporting them missing, either because of strained relationships or because police were less responsive when it came to women living on the streets. This delay gave Ridgway time to cover his tracks. The Green River Task Force grew desperate. They launched undercover stings, placing female officers in the same areas where victims were last seen. They searched forests inch by inch, finding bones and clothing scattered under brush. The killer's dumping ground stretched across multiple counties, covering such vast areas that investigators felt they were chasing a ghost. By the mid-1980s, the case had become one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. Detectives consulted criminal profilers who tried to sketch out the killer's personality. They suggested he was likely a man who blended into society, someone of average intelligence, possibly married, and with a job that allowed him to move around unnoticed. The description eerily fit Gary Ridgway, but without concrete evidence. It was just a profile, and profiles alone couldn't solve the case. At one point, detectives even reached out to Ted Bundy, who was awaiting execution in Florida. Bundy offered chilling insights. He suggested the killer might return to his dump sites, not only to relive the murders, but to engage in necrophilia. The thought horrified investigators, but when they searched, they found signs Bundy was right. Bodies had been disturbed after being left in the woods. It was a dark reminder that they were dealing with a predator who was not just ruthless, but obsessive. Meanwhile, Gary Ridgway carried on with his daily life. He went to work at the truck plant. He attended barbecues with neighbors. He remarried and divorced. He read the headlines about the Green River Killer and calmly stayed in the background, never drawing attention to himself. His ability to live 2 lives, ordinary man by day, predator by night, was one of the reasons he remained undetected for so long. The investigation dragged into the 1990s. By then, many detectives who had started the case had either retired or been reassigned. New technology, however, began to change things. DNA testing had advanced, allowing investigators to analyze evidence collected from victims years earlier. In 1987, Police had taken a saliva sample from Gary Ridgway when he was first questioned. For years, it sat in storage. Now, with DNA technology improving, that sample would become the key to unlocking the case. But Ridgway didn't know that the walls were closing in. Throughout the 1990s, he continued to kill, though less frequently. His ability to escape detection gave him confidence. He believed he was smarter than the police, that he could keep killing as long as he was careful. But he was wrong. The science that didn't exist in the 1980s was about to expose him in the 2000s. By the late 1990s, detectives had dozens of bodies, thousands of tips, and endless frustration. Families still mourned and communities still lived in fear. Yet the Green River Killer remained free. For nearly 2 decades, he had played a game of cat and mouse with law enforcement, always slipping away just when they thought they had him. But in 2001, everything changed. The DNA results came back. The saliva sample from Gary Ridgway matched several victims. After almost 20 years of terror, the Green River Killer finally had a name. And now, the world was about to learn the shocking truth about the man who had lived among them all along. On November 30th, 2001, detectives closed in on Gary Leon Ridgway outside the truck plant where he worked. After nearly 2 decades of hunting the Green River Killer, police finally had enough evidence to make the arrest. Ridgway didn't fight. He went quietly, as though he had been expecting it all along. The man who had lived as a quiet neighbor, a steady worker, and a churchgoer was suddenly exposed as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Ridgway tried to deny it first, but the science was undeniable. Hair and saliva samples taken years earlier linked him directly to multiple victims. The net had finally closed. As detectives pressed harder, Ridgway began to reveal the horrifying truth. He confessed to dozens of murders, describing in chilling detail how he lured women, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. What shocked investigators wasn't only the number of murders, but how casual Ridgway was about them. He admitted to killing so many women that he lost count. In taped interviews, he said he killed them because they were easy to pick up and because he thought he was helping society by getting rid of prostitutes. His lack of remorse was chilling. He spoke about the murders the way someone might talk about daily chores, calmly and without emotion. Ridgway admitted that after killing his victims, he often returned to the dump sites to have sex with their corpses. He confessed to arranging the bodies in certain ways, sometimes leaving them together in clusters, as though creating his own twisted memorials. His willingness to revisit the scenes confirmed what Ted Bundy had suggested years earlier, that the Green River Killer relived his crimes long after the act was over. To secure answers to the families of victims, prosecutors made a controversial deal. In 2003, Ridgway agreed to confess to as many murders as he could remember in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Instead, he would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families, it was a bitter trade-off, but it meant they would finally learn the fate of their missing daughters, sisters, and mothers. Over weeks of interviews, Ridgway led detectives to dump sites, describing where he had left the bodies years before. Some victims were finally identified, giving families a chance to bury their loved ones with dignity. In total, Ridgway confessed to killing 71 women, though investigators believed the real number could be higher. He was ultimately convicted of 49 murders, making him the most prolific confirmed serial killer in U.S. history. The sentencing hearing in December 2003 was unforgettable. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, many of them finally facing the man who had destroyed their lives. One by one, they gave statements, some through tears, others through anger. They described the pain of waiting years without knowing what had happened, of holding on to hope that their daughters might come home, only to learn they had been murdered. When it was Ridgway's turn to speak, he shocked everyone. For the first time, he broke down in tears. He apologized for the pain he had caused, though many believe his words were hollow. Some families accepted his apology, others rejected it outright. But in the end, the judge sentenced him to 49 consecutive life terms without parole, ensuring that Gary Ridgway would die behind bars. Ridgway's arrest closed one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, but the scars remained. The Green River Killer had terrorized the Seattle area for nearly 2 decades, exploiting the vulnerabilities of society's forgotten women. He had walked among ordinary people, hiding behind the mask of a normal life, while carrying out unspeakable crimes. The case also changed the way police handled missing persons and serial crimes. The failures of the Green River investigation, misleads, ignored evidence, and lack of coordination became lessons for law enforcement nationwide. Advances in DNA technology, which finally caught Ridgway, were embraced as critical tools for solving cold cases. And the voices of victims' families grew stronger, reminding authorities that no one, regardless of their lifestyle, should be dismissed when they disappear. Today, Gary Ridgway sits in prison, serving his life sentences in Washington. He is a frail old man now, far removed from the days when he prowled the streets and riversides, but his name remains a symbol of terror. The Green River Killer is remembered not only for the staggering number of his victims, but also for the chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, disguised as the man next door. The story of the Green River Killer ended in a courtroom, but its impact lives on. For the families of the victims, there will never be full closure. For investigators, the case is a reminder of the importance of persistence and science in the face of darkness. And for the public, it is a haunting tale of how one ordinary man committed extraordinary evil, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions